Hello, and welcome to the virtual Scandinavia House and today's book event, Hi, A Journey Across the Himalayas through Pakistan, India, Bhutan, Nepal, and China, with the Norwegian author Erika Fatland. And it will be moderated by Jessica Case. Erika will discuss this captivating new travelogue, which invites us to her close encounters with the many people of the regions, while also taking us on Disney high-altitude trips through the incredible landscapes and through their dramatic unknown histories. Hi is being published by Pegasus Books and available now. This talk is being recorded and will be made available on our website, scandinavias.org, as well as our YouTube page. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A sections, and we'll get to them towards the end of the program. You can purchase a book at your local bookstore, or I'll put a link to where one can purchase a book online in the chat box. Erika Fatland studied social anthropology at the University of Oslo. In 2011, her book, The Village of Angels, was an institute report on the Beslan terror attacks of 2004. She is also the author of The Year Without Summers, describing the harrowing year following the massacre on Utoya in 2011. For Sovietistan, she was shortlisted for the Edward Stanford Lonely Planet Debut Travel Writer of the Year, and Borders was shortlisted for the Stanford's Dolman Travel Books of the Year. Both are available from Pegasus, and she speaks 8 languages and lives in Oslo. Moderating today is the Deputy Publisher and Director of Publicity, Jessica Chase, who graduated from Princeton University with a degree in history and a minor in Russian. Since moving to Pegasus in 2007, she has focused on acquiring a wide array of books, including literary fiction, upmarket crime, suspense fiction, and serious nonfiction, histories, biographies, popular science, music, and narrative nonfiction. So please welcome Erika and Jessica.
Hi, everyone. So good to be here. And it's my treat to be moderating in conversation with Erika again. You may remember us from when we discussed her book, The Border, about 2 years ago. And I guess to kind of kick things off, your past books, as Kyle kind of mentioned, have kind of a Russophilic, Russia adjacent angle, right? Sovietistan obviously explored the former Soviet republics, and The Border featured where you literally traveled along the entire border of Russia. So Hi is a bit of geographic departure for you. Maybe tell us kind of what initially inspired you to take this epic journey, through the storied Himalayas.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think I'm done with Russia. I definitely think I will go back to Russia at some point. Not at the moment, but at some point. But as I finished The Border, I thought, well, now it's time for a change. I had then been working on Russia and the former Soviet Union for 10 years. So I thought, well, time to change the topic a little bit, get out of the comfort zone. And then I asked myself, okay, so, I'm obviously very, very fascinated by the former Soviet Union. And I asked myself, what could be more fascinating, more interesting than the former Soviet Union? And then the answer just gave itself immediately. It of course, it had to be the highest mountain range of the earth, the Himalayas. And that's, we'll get back to that, I suppose, but that region is so fascinating for so many different reasons.
Yeah, no, I think, it covers a huge amount of different ethnic groups and different religions and different faiths. So I think the statistics, it's actually pretty incredible. I think people think of the Himalayas as almost like a very homogenous regions, when actually it's one of the most diverse regions on Earth. Is that right?
Yes, it is. And that's, of course, because of the geography. So these mountain valleys and remote, inaccessible areas were the perfect spots for different small ethnic groups to hide away and to live undisturbed by those bigger armies that would invade in the lower territories. Mm-hmm. And then I also must add that my instant inspiration for writing this book was due to my dad's lack of literary imagination. So when I was a child, he used to read for me before I was falling asleep, but he was only reading Donald Duck, literally every day reading Donald Duck. And then there was one story by Karl Barks that stuck with me. I think it's called in English also Tralala. And it's the story goes like Uncle Scrooge is having a nervous breakdown and he can't be close to money, and that's obviously a very serious condition. And then Donald Duck and the nephews, they're trying to help him, and they need to get him away from money. So they do find eventually this very, very remote valley in the Himalayas, and they take him there. And of course, I will not be spoiling too much if I say it all goes very, very bad. And this, of course, was again then inspired by the Shangri-La myth.
Right. Yeah. So I think, just to kind of kick it off, to go to Shangri-La, Tralala, the Himalayas in general, how do you even begin such a journey, right? It is so remote and it covers so many different countries. What are the logistics of even starting a journey like this? Paperwork to altitude and
Yeah, it was very difficult. My other journeys, I haven't really planned them that much. There's been a lot of improvisation. But when it came to the Himalayas, I couldn't, you have to plan because the terrain demands it. You have to plan for two reasons. One is the altitude. Many roads, for instance, will be closed for long periods of the year. I wanted to go to base camp in the climbing season. That season is very short. It's now approximately March to May. And for many other treks, it's also just a very, very short time window. And then it's also politically a very tense and controlled region. And there are many places where you can't go on your own, like Tibet. Before, it used to be possible. It's not possible anymore. You have to go with a tour company. And everything, like literally everything, has to be planned in advance. If you are there in Tibet and you see a monastery and think, oh, I want to visit that monastery. Well, if it's not on your list, forget it. You will not be allowed to visit that monastery. So this time I did most of the journey was planned in advance. The most difficult decision was maybe where to start. Where does this mountain range begin? And that is, of course, a question of definition. Some would include Hindu Kush, and then we are in Afghanistan. I did not, also because Afghanistan was not safe at that moment, and I didn't want to get myself in trouble. So I decided to start my journey actually outside of the Himalayas. I started in Kashgar, old silk town of Xinjiang in Western China. And when you're in Kashgar, you're much closer to Baghdad than to Beijing. So you're really far west. And I chose to start my journey there because I think China will be increasingly important economically, politically in this region. And as kind of a proof of that, they are now investing huge amounts in building the Karakoram road. And that's the road that is crossing from China into Pakistan. It was not finished, so I was traveling there, but still it was probably the road in the best condition in the whole of the Himalayas.
Yeah, no, that was actually a good segue to my next question. So China just looms so large, right, in this region. I guess akin to how Russia loomed in the border, right? So, obviously when you're in China, you were in the Uyghur province in Kashgar, and, would love to kind of hear how that's shaped or disturbed essentially the people living there. But, obviously there are huge presence in Pakistan, obviously Tibet and different regions. So yeah, maybe elaborate a bit more on how China looms and obviously will continue to grow in influence.
Yes, well, I started my journey then in Xinjiang in Kashgar, and that is now, it's part of China. It's been part of China for several hundred years. But already there, it's equally tense as Tibet. And when I was there, it was the summer of 2018, and at that exact moment, the detention camps where the Uyghurs are, or more than 1 million Uyghurs are believed to be held, hit the headlines of international newspapers. And I was there. But I could not talk to anyone because it's so controlled. There was police everywhere, cameras. And I knew that if I started asking people questions or even just talking to people as a foreigner, those people would definitely get in trouble. So I could not take that risk. So it was kind of, it made Orwell's 1984 seem like a pretty innocent scenario. And it was the same in Tibet, but that's China itself. And then, as I said, it's a highly politicized region. And Himalaya, my last book was called The Border, and it's about an actual border, the Russian border. And then with high, you could easily see the Himalayas, the mountain range, as kind of a physical border between the two most populous countries on earth, China and India. And also, interestingly, like if you zoom in on the map of the Himalayas, you will see that those red lines, the borders, they disappear many places and they become dotted lines because so many places those borders are disputed. And that's between China and India, and of course also in the Kashmir region between Pakistan and India. And all of those countries have nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, it's a lot, very fraught. So going back to when you were in Kashgar in the Uyghur region, it was kind of this very kind of sad scene. You tried to go in and visit the mosque and it's empty. There are only tourists there. And then you kind of see these people outside, these old men kind of praying, like talking behind cupped hands. And, obviously they were Uyghurs kind of trying to preserve their faith. So, I think even at this last refuge, right, even these spiritual practices have kind of been hunted down. So I think, maybe tell us more about different ethnic groups and how they've kind of fled into the Himalayas and maybe are still struggling for survival, or, they're becoming just tourist attractions and not, kind of shades of them former selves.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's it. That's a very big question.
Yeah, big question, big themes.
Yeah. But let's take the Chinese-Pakistani border. Mm-hmm. So when you cross that border, you are in the Hunza region of Pakistan. And I didn't realize it then because I just started my journey, but I was already in Shangri-La. That was probably the most beautiful part I visited on my journey. And in Hunza, the people who are living there, they are Ismailis. So they are Muslim, but they practice a very moderate form of Islam. So they are following their leader, Aga Khan, who's very rich and living in Switzerland. and he says, and I don't think most Muslim leaders will say this, he says that if you have two kids, one girl and one daughter, you can only afford to educate one of them, then you should educate your daughter because she will need it more. So that is a very progressive region in the Himalayas. And also it's a Tajik people, so they speak Tajik, which is a Persian language, like they do on the Tajik border, and also on the Chinese side of the border. And that's also typical of this region, that the country borders will usually not follow the language borders or the cultural borders. So the people will be split by these political borders. And there are so many different peoples I could talk about in the Himalayas. And then as I just traveled a few hours further south in Pakistan, I left this Ismaili territory and I came to a much, much more conservative part of Pakistan. And Pakistan is mostly a very conservative Muslim country, and the most conservative areas are in these remote mountain villages, where I would visit villages where my guide and the interpreter, I did try to find a woman, but that turned out to be impossible. So I traveled mostly with a man in Pakistan. And as I had predicted, that was not an advantage because many times he was not allowed to accompany me into villages or into private homes because he was a man and he had no relatives there. So he was not allowed to see the women of the village or of the house. Mm-hmm. But that again leads to this point that I always love to make, and about how advantageous it is to be a woman. I mean, I think the most common question I get when I do talks about my books is, isn't it terribly dangerous to travel alone as a young woman? So people seem to assume that it's a disadvantage to travel alone as a woman. And I would say no, on the contrary, it's mostly a huge advantage, especially if you're writing a book and trying to talk to the people who live there. Because as a male travel writer, you would only have access to half of the population, whereas I could also talk to the women.
Yeah, I think, and I think people maybe just more, men too, more emotive or kind of able to share the kind of more softer personal stories. Actually, one thing that came to mind was you were talking about the borders and the partitions, right? How they don't, these political borders don't follow language or cultural borders at all. So kind of quote unquote, the partition, I know as a whole is this very traumatic incident in, you know, the subcontinent region. There's even like a whole subgenre of partition literature. But you met a man named Muhammad who was kind of caught on the side of the partition when the border between Pakistan and India was created. And he, I still think about the story with his father's coat. So maybe you want to share that with readers, because it really kind of quite moved me.
Yes, then, and again, this is a very politicized region, and there's been several wars about Kashmir after the partition between India and Pakistan. And during some of these wars, the borders after the war had ended, the border would change a little bit, not much, but a few kilometers here and there. And that's what happened in the northern border between Pakistan and India. So I went to this extremely remote village, and I met the Muhammad. He was then middle-aged man, and he was just a child when this war took place, which was in the 1970s. And his parents were then in Pakistan. I mean, the village was itself in Pakistan, so they didn't cross any country borders to go there. But they were in a different part of Pakistan because his mother was ill and she needed to go to some hut sources to get treatment. And then the war came, and it wasn't a very long war, and then the border changed. And suddenly the village changed country and became part of India. And the parents never managed to go back to their 4 children. And so the children were raised by their uncle and aunt. And his mother died some years later. He only found out in a letter that arrived very delayed. And then now I don't remember exactly which year, but it was 2010 or something when his father finally managed to get a visa to come and visit his children in India after being apart from them for 30, 40 years. And the son told me, Muhammad told me, that it was like a bittersweet moment when he met his father, when he was reunited with his father after this long period of being apart, for 2 reasons. One, because he was there just on a visiting visa, so he would have to go back to Pakistan. And then secondly, because in front of him stood not the father he remembered, but a very old man with a stick. And then the father left, and Muhammad made me pay attention to the jacket he was wearing. And he said that this was his father's jacket. He gave it to him before he left, and he told me he had worn it every day ever since, and he did not want to wash it because he didn't want it to lose the scent of his father.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so, it's just kind of heartbreaking. These like seemingly small human stories that kind of wend their way throughout, that I think people just open up to you and tell them, and it, makes people realize that, these borders are not arbitrary at all. They affect real families and real people. And I think, another kind of concept of borders that I found interesting about this part of the world is it's the site of so many different pilgrimages, and people come from all over, right? So on the one hand, you get these terribly harsh borders in these political regions where families are literally like torn apart and they can't get across. But then there's also this kind of the porous natures of the pilgrimages and spiritual tourism. So I know there's a couple pilgrimages that in pilgrimage sites that you witness. Lake Manas, I'm saying this wrong, I'm sure, Lake Manasaravar and Mount Kalish and the Sagadara. So maybe tell us a bit about those different pilgrimages you encounter and how they work in such a kind of contested region.
So I think what made the most impression on me of all these pilgrimage sites, and there are so many of them in the Himalayas, because it's also in the abode of the gods. So you have Mount Kailash, that is the most holy mountain in the world for both Hindus and Buddhists. So you will also have pilgrims traveling from India to visit. And then it's the dream of every Tibetan to walk around Mount Kailash twice in a lifetime. And nowadays, because of the political situation, it's actually quite difficult for them to do so, because they like the tourists, they also need all these permits to travel in their own country. But many do manage to get the permits, and in June every year they celebrate the Sagadawa festival, where they will raise a pole, and then after doing that they will walk around the mountain. And I was also going to walk around the mountain with my guide, because I was in Tibet. I was with a guide, and my guide was very happy to do this pilgrimage. But you have to pass a mountain pass on the second or third day, depending on how fast you walk. And that's higher than Everest Base Camp. It's 5,600 meters. It's really, really high. And I woke up on the day when we were going to cross that pass, the second day, and the weather was really bad. It was snowing, it was cold, and I felt terrible. I vomited, I had a headache, I mean, every sign of altitude sickness. So I told my guide, because what you should absolutely not do if you have signs of altitude sickness, you should not go higher, you should go lower a bit. So I told my guide that I'm sorry, I really don't feel well, and I think we just have to go back. And I assumed that he would be happy for me to be honest about my condition and take me back home to safety. But he just looked at me and he said, well, Erika, you can't only think about this life, you also have to think about the next. And I didn't have any energy to argue, so I just took a pill. And then somehow we managed to cross that pass with all the other pilgrims that were passing, thousands of them. And there were old blind men and women with little children on their back. And it was snowing, and it was so slippery because there was snow on top of the ice. So everyone was just stumbling and falling all constantly. And somehow everyone managed to cross the pass and get safely down on the other side. And then my guide looked at me happily, and he said, Erika, we made it. And you know what? The more difficulties you encounter, the more merit you get for your next life. So now I have such huge expectations for my next life.
Yes, I think, I suppose a pilgrimage should be, I guess, it should be kind of fraught with difficulty, right? Otherwise. And I know, I guess it's not quite a pilgrimage, but I know spiritual tourism in general, some, kind of deep and authentic, perhaps some a little less so, is also kind of endemic to the region. Obviously, you write a lot about these kind of hordes of Chinese tourists, but then there's also people that go to where the Beatles had gone in India. So how does that kind of less holy kind of tourism maybe affect the region in different areas?
Yeah, it was funny because I was kind of traveling in and out of these tourist zones because I went to many places where no tourists would go, like Pakistan. I mean, in the 1990s, Pakistan was actually quite popular among Western tourists, and it's quite understandable because they have these beautiful mountains and very interesting culture. But then came 9/11, and after that, Pakistan has been quite chaotic. So very few tourists go there. And Kashmir, obviously also very few tourists. But then I travel onwards from Kashmir to Ladakh. And Ladakh, especially maybe Leh, the capital, is like, I call it a Disneyland, a Himalayan Disneyland, because
Yes.
in these places where no one goes, you have these tourist spots where everyone goes, like Leh, like Kathmandu. There are different places in China where mostly Chinese tourists go, but there are millions of them, so that makes a crowd. Yeah, it was kind of fascinating to go in and out of these tourist places, and suddenly you would have all the comfort of a tourist place with German bakeries and well-functioning internet and cappuccinos everywhere. And then again, I would be in a very remote area where I was the only Westerner.
Yeah. So I guess, as far as the economics of the region, is there any kind of effect? I know parts can be very, obviously very remote and very perhaps poor, but then you obviously have these kind of Himalayan Disneylands, does any of that kind of reach local residents, or does this just kind of, as with so many places, does this just kind of spoil things and lead to the encroachment of kind of big companies and things like that?
Well, most of the guides that I met in Pakistan, they had, after 9/11, they had started working in construction, or they had to find completely new jobs because there were no jobs for them anymore. So that's what happens when the tourists just stop coming.
Right.
I know that the pandemic has been very difficult for many people in Nepal, in Bhutan, that are dependent on tourism.
Yeah.
In Bhutan, you have a very special kind of tourism because it's controlled by the state. So they have tried to regulate it like they have regulated everything in Bhutan. And I wouldn't say it's for the worse, maybe on the contrary, because Bhutan is such a small country. It's the only remaining kingdom in the Himalayas. Only less than 800,000 inhabitants. So there, I mean, everyone can go there. It's just that you have to pay this daily tax to the government to go there, so that the government, and hence the people of Bhutan, will benefit from tourism. And I think that's actually quite a good idea.
Yeah.
Even if it then would make it difficult for, say, backpackers to visit.
Yeah.
But if you do have the money, they are well spent, both for you and for the country. And then it's also in a poor country like Nepal, tourism is very important for the regions that do have tourists coming, like mostly the mountain regions. And then in many of the treks you do there, you will stay in with local families, and the money will go directly to them. But then you have the more extreme tourism, say Mount Everest tourism. And then, of course, most of the money will go to foreign companies, to American companies. And of course, the Sherpas who are doing the actual job, they will get money too, but a lot less.
Yeah, there's kind of pennies. And I know there's been a lot written recently about Everest and kind of the machine behind it and the treatment of the Sherpas. And so actually going to Bhutan, and Everest obviously is a part of this, but it's such an interesting kind of confluence. Obviously, as you said, it's the last kingdom in the area. They have, I think one of the titles of the chapters is Gross National Happiness. I think in that same chapter, we talk about Yetis. So I think there's just a lot, just tell us a bit more about the fascinating kind of history and culture of Bhutan and how it's, kind of a little this kind of standalone entity within this big region.
Yeah, it is an extremely fascinating country. As I said, quite small, landlocked in between the two giants, India and China. And then for some miraculous reason, they have managed to stay independent. So economically, they are totally dependent on India, but they have managed to stay politically independent, and they have managed to preserve their culture. So Bhutan used to be completely isolated until about the 1950s, and it was extremely backwards. I mean, they would literally have nothing there. No roads, no hospitals, no schools, no banks. They got their first bank, I think, in 1967 or 1968. Before that, it was bartering. So Bhutan has gone through extreme change and modernization for the last 50 years. It's also been very controlled. It used to be an absolute monarchy, so the king would decide everything. Bhutan was the last country in the world to introduce TV and internet. That happened in 1999. And in 2006, so it's a very controlled development. And then in 2006, the fourth king, abdicated, and he gave passed the throne to his very young 26-year-old son. But there was a condition, and the condition was that the son would not have that much power anymore. So Bhutan was to become a democracy or constitutional monarchy, like Norway, like Denmark, like many European countries. And then there were a lot of people were critical. So will it really happen? I mean, because the king, even if he was a wise king, he had been like a dictator, deciding everything. So how could this country really change? And the people had no experience with democracy. But actually, it's been going very well, and they have changed ever since. In every election, they have changed government. And when I was there in 2018, I asked people, but they then just changed government again. So I asked people, why do you keep changing government all the time? And wouldn't it be nice with some stability? And then people looked at me and said, well, it's nice to see what the different candidates could do, and we would like to give each of them a chance. And I mean, that's what democracy is all about. So they really got it. But if you go to Bhutan today, you will come to a country that is now very modern in many senses. People will have smartphones and iPads, and many of the young people speak English. There are still some very remote villages where there are still no roads, and you have to walk to go there, and they don't have no electricity and so on, but they are becoming fewer and fewer. So it is changing rapidly. So you also have in Bhutan now this kind of interesting generation gap. And it is a problem for Bhutan. It's such a small country that many of the educated young people, they choose to leave the country. They go to Australia to earn money.
Yeah, I guess people kind of looking for other opportunities. So I guess, kind of segueing from the, Bhutan, which still has its monarchy in place, you meet a woman named Semla, who's the former princess of Sikkim. So maybe tell us about this monarchy that didn't make it, or has kind of been, faded out and is now, just a shadow. So.
Yes. So when you travel around the Himalayas, you will see a lot of abandoned palaces, because up until 50, 60, 70 years ago, there used to be a lot of small kingdoms in the Himalayas, like Hunza that I mentioned before in Pakistan. It used to be a kingdom. And Sikkim as well used to be a kingdom. Also like Bhutan, sandwiched between India and China, Bhutan and Nepal. And the king of Sikkim, it's actually quite interesting. In the last king of Sikkim in the 1960s, I think 1963, he married an American young woman, Hope Cook, and their wedding was like a celebrity wedding in the Himalayas. It wasn't as glamorous as Grace Kelly and Monaco, but it was extremely exotic. So their fairy tale wedding was covered by all the glamorous American magazines and so on. The marriage was not a happy one. It didn't last. And also the kingdom itself didn't last very long. So first, Hope Cook, she took the children back to America. And then shortly after that, in 1975, while the whole world was preoccupied by the war in Vietnam and didn't really have any resources for another conflict, quietly the Indian army entered Sikkim, placed the king in house arrest, and just quietly annexed the kingdom. And unlike Bhutan, Sikkim had not yet become a UN member, so it wasn't like formally recognized as a country by the world. So no one intervened. And the king died a few years after. But I knew when I was there that one of their daughters, Semla, she had moved back to Sikkim as an adult. And I really wanted to meet her when I was there and talk to her. But I didn't have her contact information, so I didn't really know how to find her. So I just went to Sikkim. And on the first day, I asked the owners of the guest house where I was staying in the capital, in Gangtok. I asked them, so do you maybe happen to know this princess? Or do you know anyone who knows the princess? And then they just went to the window and they pointed at the house. And they said, down the hill, and they said, well, this is her house. You just go and knock on the door. And that's what I did the day after. And she turned out to be incredibly friendly. And she was also, I think, quite happy that anyone showed interest in the history of Sikkim. Because I think to her, it was very important that people outside of Sikkim would know that once, not very long time ago, there was such a kingdom with the name of Sikkim.
Yeah, no, I think, it's just a kind of tragic, remarkable story. And I'm glad somehow that like she hasn't also been put under house arrest or something, somehow being seen as a threat. So that I think that was refreshing to me. Jaded, I think, as things have made me. So I guess two other, just kind of segueing to two other kind of very interesting and unusual women you met. There were the local pop stars, Amrina and Ariana, that you had met. So maybe tell us those stories. They're of the Kalash people. Yeah, that was kind of jumped out to me as well.
Yeah, so that's then we're back in Pakistan, briefly leaving Himalaya, and we're then in the Hindu Kush mountains, very very close to the Afghan border. And the Kailash people, they are the only non-Christian, non-Muslim people living in Pakistan, like a pagan people. They are not many, little more than 1,000 people, and they have their own language. They have their own very beautiful, colorful clothes. They make wine. They live a very different life from most Pakistanis. And I was so lucky when I met them, I accidentally stumbled across their harvest festivals. Everyone was in their most beautiful clothes celebrating. But then, of course, life wasn't easy for them because of their neighbors. And to go there now as a tourist, you have to go accompanied by an armed guard from the Pakistani army. You will not have to pay for this, but you're not allowed to go without one because there has been kidnappings, and we are very close to Taliban.
Yeah.
But yeah, I met these two young girls who had become very famous pop stars in Pakistan through some Coca-Cola competition, and I was then traveling with a young girl from another part of Pakistan. She was with me, and when she saw them, she was totally starstruck, and she was taking selfies with them for the rest of our stay there.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I think in some ways that's refreshing, that I think that the Pakistani government is actually protecting them, right? They're not trying to kind of, I guess how the flip side would be how kind of these ethnic and religious minorities are treated in China, where they just want to kind of assimilate them, and they're, trying to eradicate any signs of like the culture. But obviously here it seems like a different story, at least on the surface anyways. So And then I guess maybe now we're back in Pakistan. I guess if we go to Nepal, which I don't think we've talked much about yet, you kind of meet and talk to some of the different living goddesses. Maybe share with us kind of what is a living goddess and how does this factor into kind of Nepalese culture?
Okay, so now we are entering the third religion here. 80% of the inhabitants of Nepal, they are Hindu. And then in the Kathmandu Valley, they have this special tradition that they believe that a certain goddess, and I cannot remember the name of the goddess because there are so many goddesses in Hinduism, but they believe that a certain goddess will enter the body of a tiny girl, maybe just 2-3 years old. And then this girl, as long as the goddess inhabits her body, that girl is a goddess. And they have, there are astrologers involved, and the girl, especially the one that is the main goddess of Kathmandu itself, she has to pass through different tests so that they can be really sure that this is the right girl. But then as soon as they have found the right girl, she will move into a special palace. She will be taken care of by a caretaker family. She will now, there's been some modernization, so she will get education. A teacher will come to her, but she will live a very special life as long as she is a goddess. Her feet are not allowed to touch the ground. So she's not, whenever she's outside of the palace, she will be carried. And most importantly, she cannot bleed because then the goddess will leave her body. So as soon as she reaches puberty and has her first menstruation, she's no longer a goddess from one day to the next. So that's like the down part of this very special childhood, because as long as she's a goddess, all her wishes have to be obeyed because it's the wishes of the goddess. But then as she becomes a normal girl, then she's just a normal girl. She needs to move out of the palace. She needs to go to a normal school. She needs to walk around in the street like other normal girls. So that was for the girls that I talked to that had lived this very special, privileged life. That was kind of a traumatic transition.
I can only imagine. And then there was one woman that you met, I think her name is Donna. And she is still a living goddess to this day. So I guess maybe she never had her menses or something like that, and could just continue, to have the goddess inhabit her. Is that true? Or
yes, she never had her menstruation, so she was still a goddess until this day. Which means that she had actually never left the house. The only time she left the house was during the earthquake.
Wow, that's amazing. So I think on the subject of kind of Hinduism, obviously the Himalayan journey is very, mountains loom so large, sacred mountains, and just kind of the environment and the geography, but obviously rivers play a big role too. There's the Ganges River, which I know is very important in Hinduism, and what's the other major river that runs through there? And I think, well, I guess we'll start with the Ganges first. Obviously, that plays a big role, and you have a beautiful picture in there of one of the big pilgrimages that happens. Maybe tell us kind of its importance and everything that means.
So, yes, of course, the rivers are very important, and the Ganges is the most holy river in India, and for a reason, because it's so important to so many millions of people. So I went to the source of the Ganges, which is in the north of India. And most pilgrims, they don't go to the actual source, they just go to the temple, because if you go to the actual source, you need to walk for several hours. And let's just say that most Indian pilgrims are not that avid hikers. But I went up there, and it's kind of comes out, the water comes out from a glacier. And it was a very special, beautiful place. And the water was so clean, because the Ganges very soon becomes, let's say, not so clean. But there at the source, it was so clean, but it also just reminded me of the fragility of the whole ecosystem in the Himalayas, because that glacier is retreating like most of the glaciers in the Himalayas. So many people call the Himalayas the third pole because of all the glaciers that are there. And those glaciers, they provide water to those very important big rivers that again provide water to hundreds of millions of people. Now those glaciers are disappearing, and they are disappearing quickly, which means that all of this fragile water system is rapidly changing, and you already see the results. More and more often there are floods in the Himalayas, and more often you have droughts, and I think we will just see more of this in the years to come.
Yeah,
even just to show how big those changes are. I visited Everest Base Camp in Nepal in 2019. Since then, they now need to change the base camp because that glacier is melting and it's too unstable. They can't have the camp there anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think I was going to ask you about how climate change is perhaps affecting the region. And I know when you were there too, I think there was some damage from a mudslide. Is that also kind of an offshoot of these glaciers melting at a much more rapid rate than ever before?
Yes, definitely. So it is becoming a more dangerous place to live. I mean, it's always been a dangerous place to live, but it's becoming more dangerous because of these rapid changes. And also Everest itself is becoming more dangerous to climb because the glacier is melting.
Yeah, everything is softer. So I guess maybe one thing to close before we open things up for questions. So kind of one of the closing chapters of the book is the very kind of poetically named Kingdom of Women. And so I guess maybe tell us, what is this amazing kingdom? Or maybe it's not so amazing. So maybe tell us a bit more about that to close, and then we can open it up for some questions.
No, it definitely is amazing. And I wanted that to be the ending chapter of the book, partly because I wanted to end with something more on the optimistic side, but also because it's actually quite representative. I mean, there are many examples of repression of women in the Himalayas. Pakistan, obviously. Nepal is one of the worst places for girls to grow up in the world, according to the UN. But also in many societies, maybe especially the Buddhist societies, women traditionally have a very strong role. In Bhutan, it's the women who will inherit, not the men, for instance. And you also some places have examples of one woman marrying more than one man, usually brothers. And then you have these people, Musu people. They live in Yunnan, which is the neighboring region of Tibet. And it's, as far as I know, it's the biggest matriarchate in the world. It's not very big, it's like 1,400 people or so. Still, it's the biggest one. And in this society, among the Musu, it's the grandmother. She is the boss. She takes all the important decisions. And also, interestingly, no one moves out. Everyone just stays in the grandmother's house. So they also have a very interesting marriage practice. Right. They call it walking marriage. So what happens is that whenever a man and a woman finds each other, they can get married or they cannot get married. But anyway, if they choose to be a couple, then the man will come visit the woman in her room in the grandmother's house late in the evening, and he will leave again early in the morning and go back to his grandmother. The children will kind of be raised by their uncles and not their father. And the people in the Musu people, they told me that this was very practical for so many reasons. Also, the divorces were so undramatic, because if the man behaved badly, they would just lock the door and he would not be able to enter.
Gosh, I love that. And also just, kind of just such an unusual way, obviously us in the West, we kind of think about marriages and habitation and where you live, and you get married, you move out, and so these kind of multi-generational homes. So I think there's just so much to absorb, and obviously we only scratched the surface of the amazing places you visited and people you met. So everybody who's watching, please check out Erika's remarkable book. And actually, one of the questions that was asked in the chat was, are there any pictures? And happy to say that yes, there's some gorgeous pictures inside of different landscapes, some of the different people Erika meets. So highly encourage everyone to check it out. So I think I see some of the questions in the Q&A that I might just share with you, Erika. So one listener asks, for how long did you travel, and how did you finance it?
Mm-hmm. I was traveling for 8 months in total. 1 5-month-long journey in Pakistan, India, and Bhutan, and then the second one 3 months in Nepal and Tibet and Yunnan. And it was a very expensive journey because I wanted to do many expensive things, like to visit base camp in the climbing season. Then I needed to go with a company that would allow me to camp there. In Tibet, I went on an itinerary of my own because I didn't want to follow any of the group itineraries, and the same in Bhutan. So it was an expensive journey. But then I've been lucky to get grants and stipends from different Norwegian associations. And so, yes, I did manage to finance it, and hopefully the book will sell very well.
Yes, that's the goal here too. So another listener asked, were there any interesting stories about women in the region that you had met that, we might not have touched on, especially since you had mentioned that being female traveling alone, that you were actually able to talk with women in a way that perhaps a male travel writer would not. So maybe anyone in particular that we might have left out today in our chat?
Yeah, I did talk to many women. And like I said, in Pakistan, a male travel writer would not have been allowed to talk to any women at all, except probably the Kalash people. They're very different, not so strict.
Yeah.
Also in Nepal, I went to some remote villages to talk to women about the Chaupadi practice, which is practiced among Hindus in Nepal, and especially in these remote villages. And that's a practice. It's forbidden, but it's many will probably have heard about it. It's those menstruation huts. So women have their menstruation, they are not allowed to sleep in their own house. They have to sleep in these small huts, and it's illegal because it's dangerous. And every year many women die because of smoke, or because of the cold, or because of snakes or scorpions. But still it's practiced. And that's because there are not that many police in the countryside in Nepal, but there are many shamans, and these shamans, they will communicate directly with the local god, who then tells the women to keep practicing this. And of course, I think for a man, it would probably have been very difficult to talk to women about such intimate subjects. So it was definitely an advantage being a woman.
Yeah, absolutely. So another listener has asked, I assume you did a lot of research before you traveled there, but what was something that surprised you when you arrived? Maybe something that you felt was missing from other, especially Western accounts of the region?
Yes, I would say what surprised me the most was Tibet. Because, I mean, everyone has heard about Tibet. Everyone knows that Tibet was annexed by China in the 1950s. Dalai Lama had to flee, and now there is widespread repression. But I didn't know just how harsh that repression was, because we don't hear that much about Tibet anymore. It's disappeared from the news. And that's not because there is no repression there anymore, but it's because the Chinese government is not allowing any journalists or diplomats to enter Tibet. And that's a very clever way to make it disappear.
Right.
But it was a scary place to visit, and the fear that I could feel among people there, among the guides, among people I met, was comparable, I think, only to what they experienced in North Korea. And the control is just getting tighter and tighter. And when I was there, one new rule that the tourist companies had to follow was that they could no longer use their own cars. They had to use government cars, because in those government cars, there would be a GPS and camera. So even in the car, you cannot talk freely.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, I mean, it is true. I remember when I was younger and Tibet was all over the news, there was like the Tibetan Freedom Concert and all of these things. And yeah, it's kind of completely disappeared from, the forefront of kind of human rights issues. And that's pretty remarkable. And I think the Dalai Lama, he's in exile, right? I'm not sure where he lives.
Yeah, he's in India. And he can never go back to Tibet, obviously. And interestingly, nor can he be reincarnated in Tibet, because the Communist Atheist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, they passed a law some years ago that before lamas can reincarnate, they need to pass an application.
Oh God, difficult. Yeah. So yeah, I guess at some point he will be reincarnated in exile.
He has himself said that if he will reincarnate, it will probably happen where he lives, which is India.
That's incredible. Yeah. So, I know that someone had just chimed in here. Our governments don't want to oppose China. So though that could change, so maybe depending on how things happen politically, maybe that will have effects on Tibet, hopefully for the better. Well, I think that's kind of it on time. But thank you so much for doing this, Erika. You always just have the most fascinating adventures and journeys and insights into just kind of parts of the world that most of us will probably never have the privilege to visit, at least not in the depth that you were able to do. So, everybody, please check out Hi. It's on sale now wherever books and ebooks are sold. Thank you, Erika, for being here. And thank you, Kyle and Scandinavia House, for hosting us. And I look forward to the book proposal for your next adventure.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Kyle, and thank you to those of you who were listening and watching.
Oh, and thank you to the both of you for participating again. You're welcome anytime, Erika, to present your wonderful travel books. So so please check out Scandinavias.org for everything that we have to offer. We have a lot of interesting Indigenous programming coming up. And thank you again, and thank you, audience, for tuning in. Okay, I hope to see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.